All right, the third antecedent I want to discuss is Martin Luther. Um, what was going on was Martin Luther was a priest monk in the Catholic Church, and he began to question some of the practices that the church was using. For instance, one of the practices was the practice of an indulgence, where somebody could pay a given sum of money and be forgiven of a sin, or have one of their ancestors forgiven of a sin. And Martin Luther saw this as a violation or counter to what it says in the scriptures, and he just thought the practice was wrong, and therefore that the Catholic Church needed to reform some of these issues. In fact, he pointed out 95 concerns, and he wrote up these 95 concerns, and he nailed them to a door on Wittenberg's Castle Cathedral Church, for which he would later become excommunicated from the Catholic Church. The point here we're making is that Martin Luther questioned God's spiritual leader. So the Pope for most people at the time was God's spiritual leader. And how can you question his spiritual leader? Well, Martin Luther did. He questioned him, and the implicit inference from that is that the Pope, or God's spiritual leader, is not infallible. And so if that is the case with God's spiritual leader, is it also the case with God's political leader? That becomes the antecedent, the precedent that was established by Martin Luther King in questioning these practices of the Catholic Church. Moving us to another antecedent of natural rights, Henry VIII. Henry VIII inherited the throne of England from his brother who died. Back in those days, when a political kingdom wanted to cement an alliance with another country, they would marry their children to each other. And so it was in England. Henry VIII's father wanted to cement an alliance with Spain, and so he had Henry's older brother marry Catherine of Aragon of Spain to cement this alliance with Spain. Well, as fate would have it, or as Catherine's or Henry VIII's brother's physiology would have it, he died. And Henry's father didn't want to lose this alliance, and so he had Henry VIII marry his elder brother's wife, Catherine of Aragon. And Henry's fine with this for a while. She produced a number of children. I believe it was 4 children. Problem for Henry, they were all females. Now, there had been a number of issues for Henry's family. The Tudors, I'm pretty sure it's the Tudors, with females inheriting the throne, and Henry VIII didn't want to deal with the issues that might come from this. He wanted to make sure his family remained on the throne, and so he decided that he should divorce Catherine of Aragon, get himself a new wife that could produce a male heir. And so he went to the Pope, and he asked the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, arguing that it was illegal because of something that it said in the scriptures. And the Pope, being much closer with the Spanish monarchy, refused to do it. Henry waited a bit of time, went back to the Pope, asked him again. The Pope refused again. Went back a third time with the same result, and at this point Henry really was fed up with it, and all along he'd been asking himself this question: if I am God's political leader in England, how can the Pope tell me, God's political leader, what to do? Because if he does, the Pope is God's political leader in England, but God has made me his leader. Therefore, I'm going to break away from the Catholic Church. I'm going to form the Church of England with me as its head, also known as the Anglican Church, with me as its head, and I will grant myself a divorce. And so that is what Henry did. Now, here is the logical inference that comes from that. If one can defy the Pope, God's spiritual leader, then one can defy God's political leader. And if you look at what happened with the American Revolution, that is precisely what happened. Interesting, just as a side note, the woman that Henry VIII married after he divorced Catherine of Aragon was Anne Boleyn. She was queen for about 1,000 days, only produced one female heir. Henry didn't want her to have the right to the throne, so he told he told Anne Boleyn that if she would sign this one order, he would not have her executed. She refused, and so he executed her by having her head cut off. And because of that, Elizabeth, who was queen when a lot of discovery of America was going on, was Anne Boleyn's daughter, just as an aside. But you get the idea here of what's going on with these antecedents to natural rights. There is a slow process of development with the idea that what has been done in the past, this idea of divine right of kings, is not inherently right. That the Lord, again with the Magna Carta, requiring the king acknowledge, as it were, that his power is not absolute, and the printing press moving forward, allowing these massive spread of ideas, and with Martin Luther questioning his spiritual leader, and then Henry VIII defying the Pope. And then with the same logic, if you can defy the Pope, you can defy his political leader. All right, so those are some of the antecedents to the Constitution. Now, question, is human nature good or evil? It's a fascinating question, to be sure. I'd love to be in class and have a little discussion about this, what you think human nature is, and my guess is we'd get a little of both sides. And I think if you would be like most classes, where it would come down is there's a component of human nature that tends to be evil, but there's also a component of human nature that tends to be good. If you look at some of the worst times in the history of the world, or some tragedy strikes, is when the other side of the good side of human nature comes out. You look at what happened with World War II and the great evil that was the Holocaust, led to the great liberation by the Allied forces of Germany for a people that were the Poles and all the Jews and the Gypsies and the Jehovah's Witnesses, all those people who were persecuted by the Nazis. This great liberation that occurred. We spent enormous amounts of money doing good. Yet there is a component of selfishness or evil within perhaps all of us. Why do we bring this up? The founding fathers, when they're creating the Constitution, they're asking themselves this question: what is human nature? Is it good or evil? And they fundamentally believed that there was a component, at least a component, of human nature that was evil. There was a lust for domination and power that was just inherent in human beings, and was a consequence of original sin. So one of the things you're going to see throughout this course, particularly as we talk about these early events, the founding fathers and society as at the whole at the time was much more religious than we are today. I'm not suggesting that we're not religious today, but their view of religion just answered a lot more questions for them than ours does today. For instance, why does it thunder? Well, in their view, perhaps God was mad. In our view, we can explain the physical realities of those things that happen, but for them, the only way they could explain a lot of things was through a reference to God. And so they look at human nature and they see this original sin that occurred, and men became carnal, sensual, and devilish, the scriptures say. And so they see this innate characteristic in human beings, that there is this domination for lust and power and greed. And so they need to create a constitution that will check those limits. Lord Acton, a famous English lord, and you've probably all heard this statement before, he said, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." It just seems to be the case. The more power people get, it goes to their head, and they begin to act in ways that are not consistent with those things that are for the good of humanity. It becomes about the good of themselves. So because of all these things, the founding fathers believed that the English government was inadequate, and the process, its unwritten constitution, failed to provide the checks against human nature that were just inherent in human nature, and so they needed a new constitution to be made that would deal with this lust for domination and power that was just inherent in each individual. And so because of that, they create the Articles of Confederation. I think this is a good place to stop. I want to make sure I get through this one before the next thing ends, so we'll stop right there.